Hey, it's Fox from Inferno Fox Gaming, and I have had my Switch 2 since its release on June 5th, so it's time for my 1 month check-in. So, as you can see, again, here is my Switch 2, and I want to get this out of the way because I'm seeing a number of individuals here on YouTube as well as other social media sites saying just how disappointing the Switch 2 is, even though, they either don't own it or don't have any intentions to get one. That being said, I want to provide my own honest feedback of this system, and we're going to break it up in a different way here, because I'm sure you've all gotten sick of seeing yet another white dude talking about the Switch 2 here. I'm going to talk about what I like, what I dislike, either gaining or reducing an overall point total. Just keep in mind that the points are made up and the score doesn't matter. It's just my own personal opinion on everything, so let's get right to it and talk about the physical system itself. And specifically the build quality. I will say that everything feels really premium and super nice with this guy. The overall matte surface just feels really great, and it surprisingly doesn't leave really any fingerprints at all. The Joy-Cons themselves, they feel a lot sturdier, and that extra inch in length makes it feel less cramped on the hands, especially if you're stuck using a Joy-Con just totally on its own. The joysticks feel a lot nice to use, and I'm still hoping that we're not going to get any sort of stick drift or anything like that the previous model had, despite the Joy-Cons not having any sort of Hall effects built in within them. I also really like how sturdy they feel when attached to the console itself. There's a small amount of give between the Joy-Con and the console itself, but I feel like it's designed with that in mind for stability's sake. It kind of reminds me of how I've heard that skyscrapers are designed to have a very slight sway in the wind, which actually helps to maintain stability of the structure itself. The mouse function is fine. It's fine, though I've only used it a couple times on stuff like Fork Knife, not counting my experience with Metroid Prime 4 at the Nintendo Switch 2 experience in Dallas. I didn't like the claw-like nature my hand gets whenever I use the mouse, but I really like how it can be used on almost any surface. And I actually like the screen here quite a bit. I can spot some of the ghosting motion blur if I really look at it while playing quick motion 2D platformers such as Sonic Mania. It's not an OLED, of course. If it were, I'd probably given it a significantly higher boost in points. But I do love the fact that the screen is the largest screen that I've seen on a handheld. And on some of the Switch 2 titles, like I've played with Mario Kart and Cyberpunk, looks fantastic. The Wi-Fi with its connectivity and overall download speeds are a marked improvement over the OG Switch. The online connectivity itself has had little to no lag when playing stuff online, and download speeds were a good amount faster. Speaking of downloads, I gotta mention this because the ease of transferring my data from my base OLED Switch here to the new Switch 2 was fantastic. Gone are the days of my previous console requiring a factory reset when transferring data, such as what I dealt with when I transferred everything from the Wii to the Wii U. What actually transferred was all of my save data and the licenses for the games that I downloaded. So, okay, it really wasn't a lot that moved, but we're gonna deduct some points here. Here's the first negative. And that's the 256 gigabytes that are on the hard drive here. I totally understand that more memory could have increased the overall asking price, but I've got over 200 digital games on my Switch, and with many of these being JRPGs, there's no way even a quarter of this would have fit on such a small amount of memory or hard drive space. And we're going to take off a little bit more here. We're taking off a little bit more because during the transfer process, it set all of my digital games that I have license for an automatic download. And there was no way to tell it to stop downloading them all at once. Therefore, I had to go and cancel each of these individual games from downloading one by one. Not fun. One new feature that surprised me with the Switch 2 was just how great the Nintendo Game Chat was. The microphone has excellent noise reduction, and it's also really great at reading my voice, even though the Switch 2 itself is normally docked on the other side of the room. The software itself does a great job presenting a number of options for individuals within Game Chat, including a surprisingly robust dictation software that, let's just say it really dictates everything that is said. But this function is not without its blemishes. The biggest one is that users cannot jump in and out of a game chat session. No, if we have 3 of us in a chat and we want to bring in a 4th person, we got to end the chat and then create a new one just for the 4 of us. And this can be kind of inconvenient if you're in the middle of playing games like Mario Kart. Like, how are you going to fit that in between races? And while we're talking about issues, got to talk about the battery life here. I understand that Nintendo is limited to what they can do given the overall lack of a significant leap in and with the current state of battery technology. Digital Foundry has found that running Switch 2 titles like Cyberpunk and Mario Kart World get around 2 hours and 20 minutes of gameplay, with higher running or more graphically intensive Switch 1 games getting a little under 3 hours. I'll be honest, kind of disappointed with that, because the OLED, this little guy right here, this guy gets me about 4 to 6 hours of battery time. And maybe it's with the OLED having the blackest blacks, allowing, some light savings here and there over time with battery, or maybe it's just with the overall battery tech improving since the original Switch 1 release that the OLED was able to see some pretty good gains. Because I'm an idiot, though, I'm going to consider snagging the inevitable OLED Switch 2 that'll come out, though I'm going to keep my eyes peeled on how battery performance will be on that newest system. Now let's talk about backwards compatibility. This was the biggest positive surprise I've had with the system, and probably the biggest win for me personally. I'm not talking about the Switch 2 editions of games such as Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. Heck, I'm not even talking about the purposeful updates Nintendo pushed for the travesty that was Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Nearly all of Switch 1 library games are either loading quicker, running better, such as with higher frame rates, or both. When I got my new system, I was about halfway through playing Trails Through Daybreak. Now, this did run pretty solidly here on my Switch 1 OLED. Surprisingly, even better than Trails of Cold Steel 3, 4, and Reverie, the previous 3 titles in this series that I played through on the Switch OLED. But when I continued my playthrough on the Switch 2, the overall movement of the camera was smoother, loading was a lot quicker, and there was no lag or stutter at all. Other Switch 1 experiences that I tested had a similar experience, and I've got a huge backlog of games to play on the Switch 1. Knowing the 2 can provide a better experience makes me really excited to hit this backlog really hard. Another big win for the Switch 2 is easily the updated Pro Controller. I first used it at the Nintendo Switch 2 experience in Dallas back in April playing Cyberpunk, and I knew from that moment on that I had to pre-order it. The buttons itself, they feel really great. The D-pad, it's better, though admittedly not the perfection that was the NES and SNES controllers. But it's the joysticks that are absolutely the best. There's just a little bit of resistance that can be felt when moving them all the way in a single direction, giving it a more tactile type of feel. And the haptic feedback within it really gives the PS5 controller a run for its money. What beats out the PS5 controller completely is the ridiculously long battery life that the Nintendo Switch 2 Pro Controller has, as well as the additional programmable buttons that are on the back of it, the GL and GR buttons. I also really appreciated the newly added headphones jack, and my Switch 1 Pro Controller is 100% compatible with the Switch 2, and that's great, but the Switch 2 can't be turned on with the Switch 1 Pro Controller for some reason. But now, let's talk about some of the games themselves. When talking about the games, we have 4 options for purchasing. We've got full physical games that are on the cartridges themselves. It appears that the only game cards that are available are 64 gigabytes. And Nintendo says that they're committed to putting their first-party games on these cartridges, although they just went against that with the announcement of Drag X Drive being digital only. The second option, of course, is fully digital downloads. No surprise there. The third option is code in a box, and EA did this, or has done this with Split Fiction, where it's the game case, but literally inside is a download code, and then there's nothing else. And last, and definitely least, is the game key card. Now, not all of the non-first-party Nintendo games are game key cards, but a majority of them are. The third-party devs are pinched a bit because it's rumored that they have to pay Nintendo roughly $16 per 64 gigabyte card. And this is straight out of the classic Nintendo playbook, literally, because back in the old NES days, third-party devs bought the cartridges from Nintendo themselves, as Nintendo manufactured all of them. The devs would buy these cartridges in bulk, paying up front and assuming the financial risk. And Nintendo did this to sort of model then under the guises of like quality control and supply chain oversight, but Nintendo monopolized the gaming market at that time and did nothing to prevent constraints like the ones that impacted gamers when Super Mario Bros. 2 and Zelda 2 came out. So this begs the question of why Nintendo is doing this now. This goes in line with one piece of news that states that even though these game cards are physical, all of the game key card sales are being marked as digital sales. This means that Nintendo themselves, with one of the larger physical to digital splits compared to its competitors when the Switch 1 led the charts, could possibly overreport sales as digital and then thus push us further into the digital age. Of course, how good will a game key card be when it'll direct the consumer to an eShop that could be just totally closed down a decade after the Switch 2 is no longer the current console, such as what happened with the Wii U and the 3DS. Heck, that wasn't even a decade when those weren't the current consoles anymore. Now, for the specific games themselves that are solely Switch 2, again, I'm going to admit my experience is a bit limited. However, during my time with both games, load time was relatively minimal, and both games looked and played absolutely fantastic. Mario Kart World has never lagged and kept at 60 frames per second, both at docked and handheld, a number of times running the game perfectly as Jamie Owls and I played online with Gaming with Crushworth and his wonderful wife, along with other friends while doing Nintendo Game Chat. That is really great. Cyberpunk ran pretty well at 30 frames per second on quality mode with minimal stuttering, though that sort of stuttering really went away when I put it to performance mode, where it looked and felt better on its 40 frames per second. All of this has me really excited for more Switch 2 games and their respective versions, such as Donkey Kong Bonanza and Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. Now, let's talk about the Switch 2 price itself. And we really all saw this coming with Nintendo, especially since we never got a price drop on any of these Switch 1 models, of course, including the OG, the Switch Lite, and OLEDs. The Switch generation is also the first one ever, really, to not feature a Nintendo Select or Player's Choice line of first-party games, where they sell their games on discount. Stated simply, though, the Switch 2 is $450 for what should be a $400 machine. This is a 50% increase compared to the OG Switch. But Fox, inflation! My counter to that argument is that the NES, released in 1985 for $200, and that included the console as well as other pack-ins depending on the bundle. The SNES that released 6 years later in 1991 also was $200, and that included pack-ins as well. Adjusting both of those amounts for inflation, the NES would have been $580. That's roughly the cost of an Xbox Series X after Microsoft, of course, increased their price recently. And the SNES would have been $440. That's a net overall decrease in price with this inflation adjustment. While I spoke of pack-in titles, the Switch 2 came with none. And it's an awful proposition to think that the consumer has to pay $10 for a welcome tour, especially since it's meant to show off the myriad of things and features that the Switch 2 can do. And the big elephant on the wall, or the fly in the room, of course, is Nintendo breaking the $80 cherry with Mario Kart World. There's also the fact that Nintendo increased the prices from what they already announced for a number of accessories. And this occurred after the Cheeto-in-Chief announced his tariffs in April, with examples of the Switch 2 Pro Controller being increased from $80 to $85, and the new Street Fighter 6 Amiibo going from $30 to $40 each. I'm honestly surprised that Nintendo hasn't increased the cost of its NSO services, put some sort of limiters on its family plans, or created a third or even more costlier tier. So let's bring this all together. Let's finish this up here and see how many points the Nintendo Switch has earned in my arbitrary point structure. Is that amount a coincidence? I don't know. Remember, arbitrary points. The Switch 2, though, serves its purpose for me personally, which was to replace this guy right here, my OLED Switch 1, and it was really showing its age at this point. Not only were its games running slow, but the rails for my Joy-Con just slipped right off. They were getting worn out. And there's also a small chip on the bottom of my Switch, and again, that doesn't really affect how it works, but it's just one of those things that, like, I notice, and it's had its wear and tear. It's time. And that said, I'm really happy with what the Switch 2 has done for me, and I'm hopeful that Nintendo continues to ensure that the overall supply chain is fed with enough systems to fill the demand for what I see is a system with a lot of potential. So let me know your thoughts in the comments section below about the Switch 2 1 month in. Really curious and love to start a dialogue with you guys. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and have a great day.